This is the first in a series of videos on conservatism, and subsequent videos will focus on the different factions within the ideology. None of these are comprehensive, but they should provide a basis by which to understand the ideology. In this video, I will provide a brief history of the political movement, which should help inform the nature of each faction in the following videos. I won't tackle the Founding Fathers, the antebellum period, the American Civil War, or conservative politicians and figures before the 20th century. But there are definitely influences from Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Grover Cleveland, for example, that don't quite line up with what we understand today as the left-right paradigm of American liberalism versus conservatism, and the influence that socialism has had on the American political system in the last 100 years. Modern conservatism in the United States has been around for several decades. The principles it's based on have been around much longer, since the Enlightenment and the American Revolution. The goal of the movement was to preserve and embrace more traditional values for the good of society, reduce the size of government in order to preserve classical individual liberties, and in the 1900s, combat the rise of socialism and in particular communism. The early form of conservatism was really starting in embryonic form, was the presidency of Warren G. Harding as a pro-business leader, and best demonstrated under the president Calvin Coolidge with his revolutionary success in fighting government regulations, opposing new laws and taxes, and decreasing the number of federal employees under his term, all while reducing federal debt. This gave way to a more domestically interventionist president in Herbert Hoover, who is often credited for contributing to the Great Depression by reacting slowly and badly to the wake of this growing national economic crisis, as well as signing the Smoot-Hawley Act, which led to the four-term presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Conservatism as we understand it today was solidified by the actions of a few people after the Progressive Era, World War I, the Great Depression, the New Deal, and World War II. That's not to say there wasn't a form of conservatism before the 1950s, but as a coherent intellectual movement, it was unpopular. It didn't really come together until the release of Russell Kirk's book, The Conservative Mind, in 1953, and William F. Buckley Jr.'s print magazine, National Review, in 1955. Both of these became intellectual vehicles by which to describe and champion what was formerly known as individualism or classical liberalism as conservatism, and this led to many more publications and outlets by which the ideology could spread. This eventually led to a coalition of sorts between the factions within the movement that we understand today as paleoconservatives, neoconservatives, and libertarians, which I'll outline in more detail in future videos. For the burgeoning conservative movement in the 50s and 60s, they were limited to what was essentially traditional conservatives and anti-communists who weren't as steeped in the traditional values or religion as the first group, but there are also libertarian influences like Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Murray Rothbard. In the 1960s, Senator Barry Goldwater published a book called The Conscience of the Conservative, and he opposed unconstitutional civil rights legislation, and he also became a presidential candidate and lost badly. Also, Phyllis Schlafly published her book, A Choice, Not an Echo, which is also influential. And these two individuals helped to combat what we now know today as modern liberalism and the encroachment of government on the individual rights of people under the guise of combating racism and sexism. These are two examples of movement conservatives, and they were across the board advocates of conservative values rather than single issue advocates or self-defined moderates who often compromise with left-wing politicians under the guise of pragmatism. They didn't always agree with each other, but they were principled ideologues nonetheless. After the failures of Goldwater to win the presidential election and the corruption of a rather liberal Republican in Richard Nixon and his removal from the White House, conservatism had reached a low point, but the road to success was paved with the election of President Ronald Reagan. In the 70s, the traditional and libertarian branches of conservatism was greeted by the neoconservatives, who were former liberals who wanted to use the government proactively to solve problems, especially in foreign policy, as interventionists. They often relied on the religious right for numbers as well. Some of the more prominent voices were Irving Kristol and Whittaker Chambers, who grappled with the institutionalized New Deal programs and the increase in federal agencies, and they wanted to combat the Great Society, but they assumed the mantle of the anti-communist right, and with the support for the Cold War against the Soviet Union by the other branches of conservatives. This group would characteristically support open borders and free trade. In the 1980s, the paleoconservatives essentially took over the traditional conservative movement and was the home of the religious right. These were also often the most ardent constitutionalists within the party who supported traditional values, were pro-life, and against programs like affirmative action. These were often anti-establishment and anti-elite types who thought neocons were too interventionist, too hawkish on war, and gave too much ground on funding entitlements. Reagan was a great unifier and brought coalitions together through a political compromise called fusionism. He was tough on communism, promoted cutting taxes and spending, was tough on crime and the war on drugs, and promoted a pro-liberty message like no president in decades. He wanted to stimulate the economy by fighting against progressive taxation and wealth redistribution, but was often framed as trickle-down economics since it targeted the wealthy who were overly taxed by conservative standards. Reagan worked with Congress to get increased military spending, and along with that, the debt increased. But he also created a heightened sense of American pride and patriotism and national unity and led towards ending the Cold War. And he was tough on the USSR until Gorbachev came into power, and then Reagan started diplomatic relations, which ultimately led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Neoconservatives would eventually cede ground lost with the Great Society in the 1990s after winning the Cold War and watching the Soviet Union collapse. The presidency of George H.W. Bush was due to Ronald Reagan's success and Bush's position as vice president under Reagan. But Bush faced challenges with the religious right and traditional conservatives like Pat Robertson and business candidate for president Ross Perot. Paleoconservatism had champions like Pat Buchanan, Paul Gottfried, and Robert Novak, who had issues with establishment conservatism that championed military actions in Iraq in the 1990s, and support for the United Nations and other international groups which challenged national sovereignty with a level of bureaucracy tied with many nations with dictatorial regimes. Paleocons did not want the United States to become the world's police force, and this led to the rise of the election of a relatively non-interventionist George W. Bush as president in 2000 on a platform of balance between isolationism and interventionism. In the wake of the terror attack against the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, that changed, and a further rift between paleo and neoconservatives occurred as to the need for the invasion of Iraq and regime change by toppling Saddam Hussein. This also led to a reawakening of an anti-war movement on the right and libertarianism, with Ron Paul essentially becoming its champion in 2008, whereas neoconservatives pushed for John McCain, who lost the presidential election to Barack Obama. The so-called Ron Paul revolution led to the Tea Party movement, filled with disaffected libertarians and paleocons and some neoconservatives, leading to a massive electoral success in Congress and in the states with governors. And then in 2012, libertarians again pushed for Ron Paul, whereas neoconservatives offered up Mitt Romney, who also catered to the religious right and some paleoconservatives, who didn't really have a significant representative in the Republican Party in those elections. This effectively leads to the 2016 presidential election and the candidacy and election of Donald Trump as president, as he reflected the anti-war sentiments of many paleoconservatives and libertarians, as well as some socially moderate liberals who were turned off by the cultural Marxists, social justice warriors, and terror groups like Antifa. Trump led a coalition of disaffected conservatives with a pro-America, populist message based on nationalism and citizenship, and tackled an entrenched liberal media establishment like no previous candidate. What's unique about Trump is that he's admitted he's not a conservative, but many of the policies he puts in place are as conservative as pretty much any conservative president in the last few decades. So what does this all mean when conservatism is defined by the actions of its champions and leaders, intellectuals and elites, politicians and pundits, activists and critics? It means that conservatism isn't an ideology that's narrowly defined, and there are different flavors of the movement, different principles and priorities, and different policy outcomes. In the next video, I will review the actual political structure of modern American conservatism, and subsequent videos will focus on the paleoconservatives, neoconservatives, and libertarians respectively. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.